What's up everybody, it's Josh Craves Tech, and today we're talking about the Blade 16 for 2025. So this was one of the laptops I was most excited to try in 2025. I had like a top 3 laptops of CES video where I talked about what I was looking forward to, and this one kind of had a lot of boxes checked. An efficient CPU, high power GPU, and a really nice sleek chassis that is fairly thin. So did it actually live up to the expectations that I had for this machine? Not really, unfortunately, but I will get into that because there is still a lot to love in this guy, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. So the one I have here is the completely maxed out spec. This is the Razer Blade 16. This has NVIDIA's new RTX 5090 in it, which has 24 gigabytes of VRAM, which finally NVIDIA gave us some more VRAM. It took this many years. Unfortunately, the 5060 and 5070 still gotta wait. But for now, 24 gigs of VRAM, RTX 5090. This one does not hit the full 175 watts. In fact, I can't really find the exact TGP. Some people were saying 160 watts. The Razer page is saying 155, so I'm gonna go with what the Razer website is saying. This also has 64 gigabytes of RAM, which you can get configured to 32 gigabytes as well. And this also has 4 terabytes of storage, which has 2 terabytes on 2 drives. And then the CPU is the AMD Ryzen AI9 HX370. Yeah, it's kind of a mouthful. Again, AMD with these names, this is crazy. But yeah, you can get it with that or an HX365, which barely has any difference, and we'll talk about that here. Same with the GPUs, you can get a 5070 Ti, which goes up to 140 watts per NVIDIA spec, and then you get a 5080 model as well. And based on benchmarks I've seen for those, I'll try to go into how much of a difference you can expect in performance between those guys. Now, right off the bat, this guy is much thinner and lighter than the previous Blade 16. The 2023 and 2024 model were kind of a step away from the traditional Blade, where these ones actually had a thicker chassis, they were heavier, they had pretty poor battery life, whereas this one's trying to compete with the Zephyrus G16. So you've got pretty much the exact same thinness as the G16. They actually look almost identical, other than the screen is a little bit thinner on the G16, whereas the body is a little bit thicker on the G16. So there might be some trade-offs there. We'll talk about that here soon. G16 is also just a tad bit shorter, although it's hard to tell unless you have them side by side. And the hinge design is a little bit different on the G16 as well. I actually really like the hinge on this guy. It's super sturdy and like nice, not much wobble at all compared to the G16. And yeah, this is a super fancy laptop. I always say the Razer Blade reminds me of like a MacBook that joined the dark side of the force, right? It's super nice matte black finish, full metal all the way around, and just a super premium design. I mean, this thing legit feels like it was like handcrafted by someone who's like very passionate about laptop design. So props to you, Razer. This thing does look amazing. Oh yeah, and this thing is a fingerprint magnet. I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera here, but there's already a million fingerprints on the bottom, and I've barely touched the top, and you can already see fingerprints on the edges here. You're gonna be cleaning this thing like every 5 seconds if you're trying to keep it nice and pristine. So, it's just something that you have to do with Razer. Either you get like a skin to put on it, or you just deal with the fingerprints. But hopefully they come out with a mercury white version, so you don't have to worry about that as much. It weighs about 4.6 pounds, which actually is a good half a pound heavier than the G16. And I know that sounds like not much of a difference, but when you're carrying a laptop with one hand or in a backpack, half a pound actually does kind of make a big difference. As far as dimensions go, it's about the same. The Legion Pro 7i here for 2025, it feels like it's like 10 times heavier than the Blade 16. Honestly, it's hard to even hold this one in one hand. The charging brick is 280 watts, which is not bad. Definitely a lot smaller than the new Legion Pro 7i 400 watt charging brick. Not bad. It's about the same size as like the Asus 240, 260 watt charger. So I'd like to see them go a little bit smaller, but overall it's not terrible. And even the cables that are like coming out of it are much thinner and easier to bend. So pretty good job. Now the keyboard got a pretty big change this year. It has 1.5 millimeters of travel now, which is actually just a little bit less than the G16, but still a huge improvement over the 2023 and 2024 models. Like just the typing experience alone is a lot nicer now. I think a lot of people who didn't like the Blade keyboards before, you're not gonna be like a night and day difference, but I will say this is much better and a step in the right direction for Razer. You do have the stupid annoying Copilot key, which I hate that they took away control for that, as they've done with like every other laptop nowadays, but you can remap that really easily in Razer Synapse. You have a huge glass trackpad here. I think it is a little bit smaller than last year's, but that's enormous anyways. Like, you don't need a bigger trackpad than this. This is definitely one of my favorite trackpads out there. It's super smooth, super quiet, although there is a bug with it right now, and I'm not sure if this is like a software or hardware thing, but every few days or so for me, the trackpad just kind of gives out completely and I can't really do anything. And this has happened for a ton of people that I've seen on the Razer subreddit, so hopefully they fix that soon with a BIOS update. I'm just putting that out there, and I'll update in the comments if they do. But yeah, here's a sound sample of the keyboard and trackpad compared to some other laptops. The webcam's nothing crazy, it's your average standard laptop webcam, but I'll admit it does handle exposure pretty well, so that's nice. Alright, Blade 16 webcam test. Check it out. Does a good job with the exposure. Even when there's a bright light, does a good job. Not too bad. Alright, so ports. So on the left side we have, the proprietary power input that these guys have, which are really prone to scratches. I've already scratched mine just a tiny bit and I'm super careful with it. Really hoping Razer gets the message one day and changes out this proprietary port for something a little easier, but for now that's what we have to deal with. You also get two USB-A ports, 3.2 Gen 2, and then you get a USB 4 Type-C port, which you can charge up to 100 watts with a 20-volt power adapter, and then a headphone audio combo jack. On the right side, you've got HDMI 2.1, and then you've got another USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 port, and then another USB 4 Type-C port. Also a UHS 2 SD card reader that is full size, so pretty nice to see that. Now there's one huge issue here, and that is that both USB-C ports only tie to Optimus, so they give a connection to the AMD Radeon graphics and not directly to the NVIDIA graphics. So the reason this is a problem is because you want to have, a Type-C DisplayPort connection that you can use to hook up to a monitor, to use G-Sync or things like that if your monitor supports that. So without that, you're pretty much forced to use the HDMI port if you want a direct GPU connection to your monitor. Personally, I think that's a real shame, and they should have just done like what Asus does and so many other laptops do, where one side is a direct GPU connection and the other side is your Optimus iGPU connection. Now, internally, we have a few major differences between here and last year. You have an extra M.2 slot, which this time you don't have to worry that it's like stacked on top of the other one, so you can insert two double-sided SSDs just fine. The speeds on the one I got were pretty fast on the first slot, and then the second slot was like Gen 3 speeds, so I'm not sure if that was the NVMe that they had installed or if that slot is just like maxed out at Gen 3. I'm not sure. I will put a caption here for whichever it is. You also get replaceable Wi-Fi 7 card, but the biggest difference of course between this and last year's model is this has soldered RAM. So it's LPDDR5X RAM running at 8,000 megahertz, which is super fast, and it can be configured up to 64 gigabytes. So I'm not too much of a hater on soldered RAM as long as you get the option to configure it how you want. So I can't really complain that you get 64 gigs if you want that. Plus, it adds to the efficiency, the thinness, the battery life. All of that comes from this soldered RAM. So until LPCAMM 2 arrives, this is the best thing you can get. Another major change here is you actually get PTM 7958 on the CPU and the GPU, which I think is awesome. Like, that was one thing where Razer was kind of falling behind, is they were using like just stock thermal paste, whereas everyone else is using like liquid metal or PTM. And I'm really glad they went with PTM actually, because you really never have to worry about replacing that. Like, it's so easy to just apply it flat from the factory. Like, the odds of getting one that isn't applied well is like super low. So hats off to Razer there. I wish other manufacturers would do the same. And of course, last thing, you have the vapor chamber in the middle there, which helps dissipate heat. I think it's a little bit larger than last year's, but yeah. Okay, now the display is the same as last year's Blade 16, which is the same that was in last year's G16, which is the same that's in this year's G16, Legion Pro 7i, Legion 7i, Acer is using this display, MSI is using this display. Literally everyone is using this OLED display. Like, if you see a 16-inch gaming laptop with an OLED display, it's this one. So they're all the same. It's a 16-inch QHD, 240 hertz OLED with G-Sync. So of course we've talked about this display before, amazing color accuracy, response times are awesome. Your brightness goes up to about 430 nits in SDR and about 610 nits in HDR. And that's like a full white window, by the way. So 600 nits is actually not bad for a full window in HDR on OLED. So good work there. But as far as I know, they can all do that. At least I tested it on my G16 and Legion, and they both hit about the same. These have an S-stripe subpixel layout, so that's like the best one for burn-in protection, so pretty good to see there. Also not bad at all for text clarity. The only downside is it will have this sort of like gritty effect on like certain gray backgrounds. You might see it when you're at like a low brightness, but it looks better than the picture that I'm showing here, but it's really only noticeable at low brightnesses. It's not the worst thing ever. It's just something that this display has. This is a panel from Samsung, and it's just one of the quirks of the panel, I guess. One thing you want to make sure though is that you turn off Windows auto color management. That might be enabled by default in Windows. It just washes out your colors. I know we're all used to this 100% DCI-P3, super popping colors. So if you want to keep it that way, disable Windows auto color management. So yeah, just make sure you change the color profile to native. It just looks better than the one it ships with, which I think was like Rec 709 or one of these. But yeah, it just makes the colors pop a little bit more. It gives it more of that OLED contrast that we all love. So definitely change that in Synapse or in Windows. It's the same thing. And looking at it next to other OLEDs, I mean, here they are, you know, they're all the same. So great display. Can't wait to see it in like every single gaming laptop that I review. Now, the speakers are also a big change this year over last year's model. They have 6 speakers now, which I think sound a lot better. They still aren't quite as good as the G16, but with some tweaking, they're actually not that bad. It doesn't have the greatest EQ curve out of the box. It actually ships with this one, this music one right here, but you can change that in Synapse to whatever you want to do. Just play around with it. I have a recommended one that I'll play here with the speaker test, and you can kind of see how that compares. So yeah, here's a sound sample.
These laptop speakers sound good. Do they sound the way that they should? Which one do you think sounds best in this laptop speaker test? Laptop speakers, legendary, yeah. These laptop speakers sound so loud and clear. Can you hear the noise? Did your eardrums get destroyed by these laptop speakers? Yeah, they're playing for you.
Let's walk through Razer Synapse because there actually are a good few quirks here that you might need to know if you get this laptop. So this is Synapse 4. A lot of people hate this software. I think I might be joining that crowd also. So when you open it up, you select the Blade 16 as a device. I found that sometimes it takes a long time to load, other times it doesn't. But right off the bat here, it gives you some stats at the top so you can check like your CPU temps, your GPU temps, fan speeds, RAM usage, storage, all that sort of stuff. There's also an advanced view, which gives you even more that you can check, like CPU wattage, clock speed. So that's actually really cool to see. I would probably leave it in the advanced view. You can even customize the advanced view if you want, which I thought was actually kind of cool. And then right below that is your key assignments. First thing I would do is change that Copilot key to control, because come on. I actually found it kind of cool how easy this was. So yeah, all I had to do was click that and change it to control, and boom, we're done. There's also gaming mode, which is sort of just the gimmick. All it does is disable the Windows key and the Copilot key, and it applies a couple little Alt Tab or Alt F4 or whatever. There's a function lock here, which you can set. You can disable the trackpad if you want. And then you have snap tap, which disables 2 certain keys from being held at the same time. And then you have hypershift mode, which is basically like an alternate mode that you can set, and you can tap the hypershift key at any time to go into that, which can have its own set of key assignments or whatever you set here. All right, so performance modes are where most of the problems lie, but we'll talk about them real quick. So silent mode is supposed to give you nearly 0 RPM fans when you're at idle or on battery. Although I found it pretty hard to get these fans to turn off. It was almost impossible, like maybe on battery for a little bit. Most of the time they were running at a decently low RPM, like they are here at about 2000 RPM. And under load, it can still get kind of loud. Balance mode tries to find a balance of performance and fans, so it's not going to be as loud as performance mode, but it will be louder than silent. And then performance mode is going to be performance, right? So more performance, higher fan speed. You also have CPU voltage optimizer, which is actually one of the coolest parts about the software now. And I wish others would do this too that have Ryzen CPUs. But basically, this feature was first introduced to laptops through UXTU, and it basically lets you undervolt your AMD CPU, and in a very easy way. All you do is just drag this down. The more you drag it down, the higher your performance will get at the same wattage, but the more unstable things become. So I found the sweet spot for mine to be around -20 or so, and I found that -30 would make programs crash for mine. And keep in mind, it stays enabled no matter which setting that you click on until you physically disable it. Now we'll talk about the fan control, and then we'll come back to the custom mode. So fan control, you actually get the automatic one, which is overall kind of high, but you have fixed fan speed. You can lower the overall RPMs of the fans to a fixed speed, which by the way, this is assigned for each power profile. So if you switch and you have auto on one and you have fixed on the other, they will maintain what they were for each profile. Keep in mind, performance will lower with lower fans, but you also have a manual fan curve, which is more like what you've seen on Asus and Legion laptops. And in theory, this should work pretty well. It's kind of nice. You can delete certain points all the way to 0, 0. However, this is largely ignored by Synapse. So you can see here, I'm lowering the fans to 0. It even says 0 RPM, but that is just a straight up lie. The fans were running just as loud as they were even when I didn't have it set to 0. So it seems to only follow the fan curves to a certain degree, if at all, honestly. Okay, now let's talk about CPU custom mode, which I don't really know how I feel about it. You had a lot more options on the older Blade 16s here, but you basically have a CPU preset, which you can choose low, medium, or high, but you cannot have high selected on both CPU and GPU at the same time. One of them has to be at least medium. Or alternately, you can have it on a CPU power limit, but keep in mind if it was set to high before you selected the CPU power limit, that GPU high is still going to be grayed out. So here you can set the CPU from anywhere to 45 to 95 watts. Just keep in mind anything over 78 is actually ignored because that CPU is really not going to hit over 78 to 80 watts ever. Also keep in mind if you enable the CPU voltage optimizer that you cannot adjust the power limit, which is super weird, and it also creates a bug where the CPU performance just tanks if you're in custom mode and you have the curve optimizer enabled. And also on custom mode, you are locked out of fan control. You can only use the automatic fan control. So overall, I just don't recommend custom mode. It's just kind of pointless here. I found it really pretty much performed the same as performance mode, and sometimes it would perform worse and sometimes a lot worse. So yeah, I really don't know how to feel about that one. Moving on the display tab, you can choose between 60 Hz and 240 Hz. You also have the keyboard shortcut function plus R, and you can also have it change automatically to 60 Hz when it's on battery. However, I did notice when you plug it back in, it stayed at 60 Hz for me, so I had to manually switch it back to 240. One thing I like is you have color profile selections here. I found that the native profile looks the best for day-to-day use, but the others also look pretty good, DCI-P3, or you can select sRGB to have it clamp down to only sRGB colors, which might be more accurate for programs like Photoshop and things like that. And then in GPU mode, it sort of tries to explain NVIDIA Advanced Optimus. So you can click this, which basically just opens NVIDIA control panel and lets you choose between NVIDIA GPU or Optimus only. I always recommend selecting this option to show the desktop control, so that you can do this on the fly and just to know which GPU that your laptop is actively using from your system tray. Now in the sound tab, this is basically your THX EQ. So you can see my custom EQ here. I found that to sound a lot better than the stock EQ that it comes with, which was set to music by default. Click this little icon here to flatten it out and start over. That's about it there. And then battery health optimizer, you can set a battery charge limit as low as 50%. This can help eliminate battery degradation over time. And then power profiles on battery, you're only allowed to choose balance for some reason, and you can only have auto fans or a fixed fan speed. Okay, lighting tab. So this is where you can go to select the brightness of your keyboard lights as well as the logo on the back of the laptop. You can link the effects between plugged in and on battery, or you can have them act separately. So for a lot of people, if you unplug, you probably want the logo light to turn off to conserve power, which you can do that here. And there's also the timeout for how long the lights stay on when they're idle. And as far as lighting effects go, you have some basic ones here, but you can also launch the Chroma Studio if you want to do a little bit more advanced settings. I did appreciate how easy and simple this was compared to some other ones out there. It even picked up the mouse that I was using right off the bat. Everything else is kind of just little gimmicky stuff. You can have a music visualizer play, or you can connect to other RGB devices through Razer Chroma. There's a haptics tab, I guess if you have something that's compatible with haptics. And then there's of course like the settings tab, which just gives you some settings. Also heard of a third-party software called Razer Control. I didn't really test it on here. I've heard it doesn't work. I've heard the guy just kind of vanished and stopped working on it. But honestly, I could see the vision. Like this thing with some third-party software could really unlock this thing and probably get around some of the bugs that people have. So someone should take over that Razer Control or just help that guy out who was working on it. Just a quick shout out to him. All right, so fan noise is one of my biggest problems with this laptop. In silent mode, it's not really that silent. Silent mode does have the fans turn completely off sometimes, not all the time. Like right now, it actually just turned the fans off and I've been recording for like 30 minutes. So yeah, another problem I have is silent mode under load is super loud. I'll throw the decibels on here in a second. In fact, I think it's the loudest silent mode I've ever recorded on a laptop. And I thought the Flow Z13 was pretty bad in this regard, but yeah, this one takes the cake for loudest silent mode, which is weird because like the 2023 and 2024 Blade 16 had a really quiet silent mode and in fact a really quiet balance mode too. The balance mode isn't too bad, still a bit louder than the competition. And then you'll see in turbo mode, this is probably one of the loudest laptops I've ever recorded, especially in the thin and light category. Like I know some people are gonna be like, oh, it's so thin, of course, you know, the freaking fans gotta go up, but like not that loud. Like that's kind of crazy actually. So, you know, we're hitting over 50 decibels easily on this guy. You know, we're surpassing the G7 G16. They're not like whiny at all, at least, but it's still loud. And I'm gonna go a little more in depth with that in my time spy to fan noise ratio chart. Good thing though is you do have some fan control on this guy, but Razer Synapse kind of likes to ignore some of the inputs that you do. For example, there's fan curves now, which are, you know, great by principle. You can try and set the fans to off, but it doesn't actually turn them off. You know, it'll just straight up lie to you and say that it's hitting 0 RPM when it's not. And you can sort of get around it with like setting an RPM that is a little bit lower than what the stock RPM is. But I found this to be a pretty hard trade-off between performance and noise on this guy. Anytime I turn the fans down, the laptop would just kind of throttle, even if it wasn't hitting the worst temperatures. What I'm thinking is happening is that there's like a keyboard temperature sensor in here somewhere, and it's throttling based on that rather than the actual temperature of the GPU and CPU, but we'll get into that a little bit more in a second. So yeah, it's really hard to find a good balance of noise and performance on this guy. And I do want to talk about the cooling pad as far as noise goes. If you're trying to get anything that's even remotely quiet, the cooling pad is not going to do that. Like this cooling pad right here will easily make that thing go over 60 decibels, no problem. And that's with like a decently low setting. I'll show you a sound sample here in a second, but like it's hitting over 60 dB, and that is loud, okay? The way decibels scale, 60 decibels is basically twice the volume as 50 decibels. And I think about 5 or 6 times as intense of a sound compared to 50 decibels. So that's a lot. So while it's great for temperatures, you're not gonna get any quieter with the cooling pad. All right, so the fan noise to time spy graphics ratio chart. I say it in every video. This is my science experiment. This is my baby right here. This basically shows you how much graphics performance you're getting for each decibel of fan noise. So there is gonna be a GPU bias. Obviously, higher tier GPUs are gonna perform better here, but it does help eliminate, you know, okay, is the laptop performing really well only because it's loud or because it's actually good? So you wanna see these light blue bars here, which is your fan noise in decibels. You wanna see those low, and then you wanna see the dark blue bars higher. That is how much graphics score you get for each decibel of fan noise. So you can see in turbo mode, the Blade 16 is falling behind 4090 laptops, which is really not good to see. And that's because it's hitting 54 decibels. This is now almost the loudest laptop I've ever recorded. And let me tell you, 54 decibels is a lot louder than like 49 or 52. You got to think each decibel of fan noise is about 10% higher volume. If you compare it to the Razer Blade 16 from 2023 and 2024, you're looking at like a 60% volume increase in turbo mode. That is insane. And yeah, with the way decibels scale, 54 can be heard from the next room over, maybe even like 2 or 3 rooms over with the door open. In balance mode, it is the loudest laptop I have recorded at 50 decibels with nothing else even coming close. This guy is louder in balance mode than the Blade 16 from last year was in turbo mode. So 50 decibels is still going to be heard from the room over. We're getting 403 points per decibel here, but it does score fairly high. So just keep that in mind. You know, even though the G16 here is only hitting 41 decibels, it's just the Blade 16's performance, and the higher GPU tier, of course, gives it a higher spot on this chart. And then it finally passes the Blade 16 of last generation in silent mode. But again, it's the loudest laptop I've recorded in this mode at 43 decibels. You know, that's like 50% louder than something hitting like 38 decibels. So it only scores so well here because it hits a very high score in its silent mode. It's just not ideal if you're going to have this in the room with other people. At 43 decibels, it will definitely be noticed. And if you watch the software part of the section, you can see how you can sort of mitigate the fan noise by using the custom profile and turning the fan noise down. Just be aware, you know, if you manually turn down the RPMs, it still has like a minimum. Performance does drop quite a bit the further you turn the fans down. And of course, the keyboard temperatures will get a bit warmer as well. You can also try the fan curves, although I found that the way that Razer treats fan curves is really weird. Like if you try to set all fans to 0, it just straight up ignores that. And it'll even say that both fans are running at 0 RPMs when you can clearly hear them going. So the fan curve, yeah, don't fully trust it. It seems to only follow it to a certain degree. Battery life is another thing I found a little quirky with this guy. So it's weird, right? It's good, but only when it wants to be. So it took a lot of experimenting. Like I had to turn this thing off, had to restart it. I had to like try and disable everything from startup. I had to go in the Windows tray and disable everything, close out everything there. I tried everything I could to make it not use the GPU, not ramp up the CPU, not ramp up the fans. And it takes a while to settle down, and it will eventually get there. But like I've kind of found like for the first like 10, 15 minutes, it wants to use like 20, 30 watts of power, and you could get it down to like 7 to 10 watts easily. But it took a lot of kind of experimenting. Some people I was talking to had no problem with battery. Some people I was talking to had no luck with battery. So it seems to be kind of up in the air. And I don't know if it's like a software bug or what, but I could get anywhere from 8 to 9 hours if I was actually hitting that nice wattage that I wanted. And if I wasn't, you're looking at like 3 or 4 hours. I think what's happening is there's no way to disable the GPU for Razer. Don't know why they haven't done that. Like everyone has done that now. HP, Asus, Legion, everyone has an option for disabling the GPU, especially when you're on battery, but Razer does not. So if anything pings the GPU, whether that's like a sensor going off or a program that is reading the GPU, it's going to cause, you know, more battery discharge. So it's hard to really get that right. And I really wish Razer had implemented something a little better for controlling the battery life and getting it as like solid as something like the G14 or G16. Those guys, I had no problem with those, you know, hitting like the rated hours that I was expecting every single time. Another thing I want to talk about on battery is that it gets really sluggish, and I think it's the single core. It only measures about 5 watts on battery. So you'll see here, I'm trying to open Synapse, right? And you know, it's doing it, but it's slow, right? I'm just trying to go to the Razer, you know, the Blade 16 device page, and it's still loading. So what I found is that the CPU is capped at around 2400 to 2700 megahertz, and single core speeds are capped at about 5 watts, which will make it feel pretty sluggish. Again, I'm not sure if that's like a bug or if that's intentional. You know, I know they want those battery numbers high, but yeah, when it does hit that low wattage, man, it is a little too sluggish, and there's no way around it. Like I even tried UXTU to sort of like bump up the wattage on battery, and you just can't. So yeah, don't expect to be doing anything intensive on battery. You're kind of just stuck with what you got. USB-C charging though isn't the greatest as far as performance. It's fairly low, but it does allow you a couple more options in Synapse versus the regular battery one, which only lets you choose balanced. Oh, and side note, make sure you don't set Windows battery saver to always. It will just plummet your CPU performance even more. So just make sure you set it to like, you know, turn on when unplugged or at 50% or whatever you want to do. Just don't set it to always. All right, so CPU performance. Now, here's where I have a lot to say about this laptop. Okay, the Ryzen AI HX 370. It might have a terrible name, but it's actually a really good CPU. It's been around since last year when it was introduced on the Zephyrus G16, and yeah, it's great. However, Razer is holding it back for some reason on this laptop. It's only gonna reach 78 watts peak, and that's kind of low. Like even the G14, which is a lot smaller than this guy, can easily push its CPU past 80 watts. So I can't really think of an excuse here for Razer to be capping it so low, especially when the CPU as a whole runs fairly cool compared to most other laptop CPUs out there. So basically that CPU power level in Synapse is a straight up lie. You know, it lets you hit 95 watts that it says. It doesn't. This is one of those things, it's like everything that I'm experiencing, I don't know if it's a bug, but it's kind of annoying when I'm trying to review the machine. I just want it to work how it says it's gonna work. You know, if the CPU slider is set to 90 watts, I would love for it to hit 90 watts and be able to measure that in something like Cinebench or something. So not only that, but like I mentioned on battery, it cuts it way down to a sluggish 5 watts on single core, and you can't do anything in UXTU, which this is the only laptop I've ever tested where UXTU did not work at all. Like I can't go past stock limits. I can't undervolt off UXTU. I can't control or change anything. So I guess like the limits of this laptop are hard baked. I don't know how they did that, but yeah. And undervolting is a nice feature that they added in Synapse. Actually, I think that's really cool that they did that because a lot of these Ryzen CPU laptops do not have that feature included. I really wish Asus would put this in Armory Crate because a lot of people just use G-Helper or UXTU to do this. I mean, it's pretty much free performance. However, the CPU undervolt's okay. I mean, you get like maybe an extra 100 megahertz if you go to like minus 25 or so on the curve optimizer. You know, not much changes there. The Cinebench score stays about the same, maybe just slightly higher. I also tried to use Hyper Boost with the cooling pad to get more CPU wattage, but still didn't work there either. Honestly, it barely helps the GPU as well, but we'll come back to that. So looking at the CPU graphs here, it's pretty much gonna fall right in place with the Zephyrus G16 from last year that had the same exact CPU. So yeah, about that 23,000 or so in Cinebench R23, a little over 2,000 single core, which is overall a great result for an efficient CPU. You know, I really wish AMD would have put that AI Max CPU that the Z13 has, because that is a little bit embarrassing when a tablet is beating out almost everyone on this chart. But there's only so much much you can wish for with 2025 laptops, unfortunately, but overall, this is still a great CPU. It's doing awesome here, beating out the Ultra 185H from Intel in turbo mode, and then same thing in balanced and silent mode. It does really well. This is where you can start to see it kind of climb up the graph and start to pass some of these higher powered CPUs that are running at much higher wattage. And I'll solidify that even more when we look at the power scaling graph. Now you can see on battery, the score does go down quite a bit. It actually falls below the HX370 and the G16. That's because they just really lowered the wattage way too much. And look at that single core, not even hitting 1,000. That's where you're going to see that sluggishness on battery, because that single core is just way too power limited. So you have other laptops like the G16, which are running way higher, almost hitting their full plugged in single core performance on battery. Yet they're actually getting about the same battery life as this one too. So again, not sure if that's a bug, but super weird move on Razer. On USB-C power delivery, it's actually about the same as it is on battery, just slightly better single core, but again, feels kind of sluggish. Not gonna lie, they definitely got to fix that to make this a usable laptop. Okay, so the power scaling graph I was talking about, don't get scared. This is actually the most important graph for the CPU on any laptop, and I'll explain. If you don't know about this graph yet, not many reviewers actually do this, but it actually really shows how much a CPU can do, and it actually also explains why things like MacBooks do so well here. So our yellow glowing line here is the Ryzen 9 AI HX370. When you're looking at CPU performance on a laptop, you know, desktop users only want max performance, max wattage, they don't care. Laptops want the lowest amount of wattage, but the highest amount of performance. So you want your laptop to be far to the left, and you want it to be up high. So each wattage point on this x-axis shows a different Cinebench R23 score on the y-axis. So you can see at 10 watts, this actually is not a bad CPU. Even at 5 watts on multi-core, it can do decently well compared to most other CPUs. Where it's really killing it though is like the 20 watts, 30 watts, 40 watts, 50, like everywhere up until about 80 watts, this CPU actually outperforms most HX CPUs in other laptops that are much thicker than this one. And that's what we like to see, because when you're playing games or running programs, you want to see your CPU run cooler, quieter, and this one is capable of that. The only thing really beating it is, of course, the Ryzen AI 9, which we would have loved to see in this laptop, or the new Core Ultra 275HX from Intel, which actually doesn't even start beating it up until about 50 watts. So really anywhere from, 10 to 40 watts, this CPU is kind of king still. And in games, it only runs around that range anyway, so it's doing really good. And it's still, I would argue, a very relevant CPU even in 2025. It's just where it starts to fail is anything after about 70, 80 watts really gives you diminishing returns, whereas these HX CPUs can hit all the way up to, almost 200 watts and just keep getting more and more performance. Although you never see that in games. And I'm throwing in some MacBook numbers here just to show you why those perform so well. You can see like the M3 Max, M4 Pro, M4 Max, at the same wattage points, those actually surpass this laptop CPU. But you can actually see this one is surpassing some of those like the M3 Pro and the M4 Pro 12 core. So it is a MacBook competitor on the CPU side as far as multi-core goes. It's just on the single core side, which I'm showing here, even though I don't have it on this graph, I wasn't able to measure it because of Razer's bugged single core being super low, but it's very similar to AI Max here where, 5 watts or so is giving you like less than 1,000 points on Cinebench, whereas these MacBooks are hitting, the equivalent of like 30 watts at 5 watts. So that's why you see MacBooks always perform so well on battery, and they do so good in single threaded tasks. Now, Cinebench 24, I'm not a huge fan of. I don't think it really reflects overall CPU performance that much. It actually makes this one look like it's kind of close to like the 14900HX, when in reality, it's not very close at all to matching that one at their highest performance modes like they are here. So yeah, not my favorite benchmark, but it is a decent result. Also, I know CCD latency or core-to-core latency was kind of bad in the Ryzen AI 9 HX370 chip before, but it seems like AMD did put out a patch for that. So we're getting 57 nanoseconds on average of core-to-core latency, which is not bad, where it used to be like, I think like over 100 nanoseconds when the G16 first released with that same CPU. All right, GPU performance. Now, this is where I am the most frustrated with this laptop is the GPU. So the RTX 5090 is running at 155 watts here, or 160 watts, depending on who you ask. I'm not really sure. Their website says 155, and that sounds great in practice, but in reality, it's barely giving us any gains over an RTX 4090. Sometimes it's even beaten by full wattage 4090s or even RTX 5080 laptops. I found most of the cause of that though to be it's not actually using anywhere near that 155 or 160 watts that it's rated for. Usually in GPU bound games, which are most games when you're playing at QHD or higher graphic settings, you're gonna see your GPU stay pretty much close to that max wattage that it's rated for, and your CPU kind of ducks down a bit. This one one doesn't really like to do that. It doesn't really like to go beyond 130 to 145 watts. So in reality, like wattage wise, it's actually closer to a Zephyrus G16 than it is to like a Legion Pro 7i or HP Omen Max 16. And you know, of course it is, because those laptops are twice the size, but it's just kind of sad because I really thought this was going to be the perfect hybrid power and portability laptop this year. I was really rooting for Razer to just do the thing, you know, like no one else was doing this, like giving that much GPU wattage with this thin and light of a device, with battery life. You got the efficient CPU, you know, let those things run at a decent combined wattage. I was thinking it was going to be like 150 to 160 on the GPU and like maybe 20 to 30 on the CPU, which is plenty usually, but yeah, it just doesn't do that here. I think if the chassis hadn't been cut down so much in size, that maybe this would have been possible, but there just isn't quite enough to handle that wattage. It also doesn't even let the GPU get close to 87 degrees for some reason. Like the thermal limit on these is usually 87. So maybe that's another reason why, like just really strict thermal limits. So like I show in the thermal section, that keyboard does get pretty warm in the middle, not so much on the sides, but I'm thinking maybe that's the thermal limit that they're using for the GPU and CPU temperatures rather than the actual CPU temp limits and GPU temp limits that are set in place by NVIDIA and AMD. And now I know it sounds like I'm knocking this really hard, but like in reality, it's still a really good blend of power and portability. And it's still in fact scoring higher than the G16 in the benchmarks that I've seen so far. I mean, you know, that's hitting like 120 watts or so, whereas this one is still hitting like 135, 145. So still gonna be better, you know, it's getting about 22,000 or so on the graphics score in time spy. So I guess I was just maybe a little too hopeful for getting a bit more out of this guy. Cause yeah, in all honesty, you're not gonna get this much graphics score out of a laptop that thin anywhere else. And we also need to talk about frame generation. Like it's surprisingly good. That's coming from someone who absolutely hated that NVIDIA added that as a gimmick in 2025. Even when I said in my 2025 laptop predictions video, I said there was no way they were gonna make another gimmick, you know, since we already had frame gen, and they still managed to make that happen. So we have to talk about 3D Mark Time Spy as sort of a preface to gaming benchmarks, because this is pretty much gonna tell you where the laptop is gonna fall in most games. This benchmark is really good, especially the graphics score, for telling you kind of just how your laptop is probably gonna perform. Now I will say Time Spy's CPU score is not super reliable. You know, you're seeing it hit like 9K here when in fact the CPU is much more powerful than one that would be scoring 9K. So, you know, take Time Spy's CPU scores and combined scores with a grain of salt. Because of that, we're really gonna look at the graphics score here, because that is a much better data point for what we're gonna see in games. So you can see it hitting about 22,000 here. Not super great. I have seen people hit like 23K out of the box on theirs. I have no idea how that happens, but I noticed it's hitting about 130 to maybe 145 watts in this benchmark, which is nowhere close to that 160 watts, and it's the same case in games as well. So maybe some people just got a better bin GPU, but overall, most of what I'm seeing is people hitting that low to mid 22,000 range. This puts it just a little bit behind the Legion Pro 7i's 5080, which is hitting about 23,000, but you'll see in games the extra VRAM from the 5090 I think does contribute to it pulling ahead of the Legion, unless the game is a little bit more CPU bound. Overall, neither of them come close to the HP Omen Max hitting almost 25K, and with a little overclock it easily hits like 25.5K, so that one is actually not a bad result at all. But the same lead that you see here is kind of the same you're going to see in most games. So in balance mode, it does actually pull ahead of the entire competition, which in games you'll see that too. In balance mode and silent mode, it sort of catches up to pretty much everyone else in every game, and sometimes even takes first place or at least ties with the Omen Max. And then on battery, it still does really well in the graphics department, even though the CPU gets neutered on battery, which I already talked about. And on USB-C power delivery, it's doing okay. It's just so funny to see the Flow Z13 here, which is a 13-inch tablet, beating everyone here on USB-C power delivery. I've also been running Steel Nomad because 3D Mark has been really pushing that, although I don't consider it as dependable or, you know, as reflective as Time Spy graphics score, but I'll just throw those results in here. You can see it looks like it's a lot closer to the Omen Max, when in games that's not usually the case. But I went ahead and threw in a desktop 4080 that I had here that I was using for a little bit, and you're starting to see like the 5090 does start to get decently close to a, you know, sort of CPU limited RTX 4080 desktop. However, when you're thinking about the generations, you know, like the 4090 and 4080 were kind of ahead of the previous generation's top tier desktop. You know, the 3080, they were kind of approaching 3090 Ti levels. So it is a little bit sad to see that a 5090 cannot beat a 4080 desktop, but hey, that's, you know, kind of the state of things right now. But I do want to talk a little bit more about this cooling pad right here. Okay, this is the Hyper Boost Razer cooling pad. It enables a Hyper Boost mode in the Razer Synapse software, what it's actually rated for, and what you can actually even see in NVIDIA control panel is that this GPU should be able to hit 175 watts. It doesn't. I think I got maybe 169 watts max with this guy, which is good, but that's like the peak wattage that I got. Like, it was more hovering around like 145 at the lowest, but I got it up a little bit, maybe like 155, 160. The 169 watts was in very few scenarios. Like, a lot of the time I was still around the same wattage, maybe like 10 more watts in like the stock one. And sometimes I even lost FPS in some games for some reason, but it seems like it increases the combined CPU plus GPU load a little bit. But overall in games, like, FPS was about the same. I mean, benchmark numbers went up a little bit, but really not much at all. And I even tried every clamp. I think the A clamp actually worked the best for performance, even though it actually looks like it's blocking the fans when you use it. But yeah, it works. And another thing I don't really like with the cooling pad is the way it actually integrates with the Razer laptop itself. So in Synapse, I thought this was going to unlock a bunch of more options. All it really does is unlock one button, and it's dynamic. Like, everything has to be the way Razer sees it. Like, you can't control anything at that point. Once you hit that hyper boost button, it's up to the laptop and this guy what it's going to do. So you can't control fan speeds anymore. You can't control your CPU boost. You can't control your GPU levels. You can't set CPU to medium or low or whatever. You can't do anything. Hyperboost is its own power profile, and it does what it wants. So that's kind of a bummer. Like, getting this should give you more control over your laptop, not less. So that's kind of weird. Please change that, Razer. Seriously. Now, of course, if you guys have been following my channel, you know me. I always do a VBIOS swap to try and get more performance out of the GPU from these laptops. Yes, there is a risk to that. You know, I have a whole video about it, but I wanted to just try it here. However, it didn't work, unfortunately. So, and I think it's because of just the way this is tuned with Synapse running everything. It's actually rated at 175 watts already in NVIDIA control panel. So swapping to another 175 watt VBIOS, which I tried a few of them, didn't change anything. It still ran at the same wattage that it had with the stock VBIOS. So that was sort of sad to see. I tried this with and without the cooling pad, and there was no difference. Now, as far as thermals go, this machine is actually pretty great. Like, I have no real complaints other than maybe the keyboard temperatures, which we'll get into in a second. But is this thing gonna burn your hands off? Well, it's yes and no. So the previous Blade 16 did get a pretty warm keyboard, and they did something different here. They tuned it to where the left and right sides of the keyboard stay extremely cold at like mid to high 20s at the most. So we're just on battery here, and then only like low to mid 30s in the center, which is plenty comfortable and just fine. And that's pretty much the same when we're plugged in on silent mode. We're hitting mid to high 30s now in the center, still not bad. Now, when we're under load, that's when things change. You can still see that the left and right of the keyboard stays extremely cold, mid 20s, but then the center gets warm, all right? You're getting 46, 47 degrees. And then, of course, you know, that area at the top, you're not supposed to touch, but that hits like 50 and beyond. Touchpad area still stays relatively cool though at mid 30s. All right, so let's look at the wattage and temperatures of this guy, because a lot of the performance boils down to this. So we're gonna look at each of the power modes, and we're using Shadow the Tomb Raider so that you can, you know, compare on your machine. This is easy to replicate. You can download the demo on Steam if you want and run this benchmark. And I'm gonna try and give you an idea of what you'd be looking at in a GPU bound game, you know, high settings, high resolution, and also when you're CPU bound. So think like Apex Legends, Counter-Strike, you know, esports titles, stuff like that. And we're gonna simulate that by adjusting the settings on this benchmark, since it's really good for pushing your hardware to its limits. So starting with GPU bound, turbo mode, right off the bat, you can see we're hitting nowhere near that 160 watts that we're rated for. Looks like on average, we're getting about 135 to maybe 140. You can even see it dip down to like 120s sometimes, which is getting close to Zephyrus G16's levels. Although the GPU temps are not too bad, it almost seems like there's an 80 to 82 degree thermal limit, because it seems like the wattage dips down and does not allow the GPU to get any hotter than that. The CPU is pretty much chilling like 30 to 40 watts here. It could honestly go lower. It doesn't actually need that much. I've seen like the G16, for example, with the same CPU hit like only 20 watts in this benchmark and still do really well. But temps are not bad here, only 79 to 81, 82 degrees. So really not bad temps there for the CPU. You can see balance mode actually runs about the same as turbo. Look at this, like 120 at the lowest to like 135 watts on the GPU. Sometimes, you know, hitting 140 watts. And that almost makes me think that like maybe the Blade is just tuned wrong from the factory, and this was actually supposed to be balance mode, and turbo was actually supposed to hit, you know, that 160 60 watts, because there's really no reason this needs to be running at the same exact wattage as turbo mode with just lower fan noise. But I mean, the GPU is still hitting, 80, low 80s on temps. The CPU is hitting, high 70s to low 80s once again at around that 30 to 40 watt range. And then now we're in silent mode, and you're probably starting to wonder, okay, what in the world, right? So why is the GPU still hitting, 105 to 115, 120 watts almost on the GPU in silent mode? Now you're seeing where that fan noise is coming from in silent mode, because yeah, it could have easily ran this at like 90 watts or so and been just fine and could have lowered the fans, but hey, you're still getting good temps here. Fans are blaring, but hey, you're getting like mid 70s on the GPU, mid to high 70s on the CPU, and while the CPU is running like 20 to 35 watts still, so not bad. So overall temps in GPU bound scenarios are good. I mean, I don't see this ever being an issue. Now let's look at CPU bound. All right, so when we're in our turbo mode, performance mode, we're seeing the GPU come down in wattage, but we're not really seeing the CPU go up in wattage like it should be, which I thought was really weird. So, we're getting lower temps across the board, of course, because not as much power is being used. We're getting low 70s, but yeah, I'm still not seeing that CPU hit over 30 watts here. We're hitting like 35 at the most, which is kind of crazy. And we're at 1080p lowest settings. This usually always pushes the CPU for almost any laptop to like 40, 50 watts or beyond. It's the same thing in balance mode, 60 to 70 watts on the GPU, like 30, 35 watts on the CPU. So again, balance mode is almost identical to turbo, and then silent mode is almost identical as well. 50 to 60 watts on the GPU, 30 to 35 watts on the CPU yet again, and temps are, good across the board, of course, but I would love to see a lot more power getting pumped out of the CPU here. So again, this is just weird fan tuning, weird power tuning by Razer. Not really sure what is going on. Looking at the cooling pad, right? If you put cooling pad next to no cooling pad, it looks like a pretty significant difference. We're getting like 15, 20 watts more on the GPU, while the CPU stays the same and temperatures are way down across the board. You're talking about, 10 to 15 degrees less on the GPU, and again, like 10 to 15 degrees less on the CPU. And in some cases, we're looking at like 15 or even 20 more FPS here in the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. However, this is the only benchmark that I have where it had a decent lead over the non-cooling pad version. And then same thing in Time Spy. You can see it is getting like 10 to 15 more watts on the GPU. Sometimes it's only like 5 or 6 more watts on the GPU. So that's my guess as to why nothing is really changing, is I think in games, it's actually only getting like those extra 5 watts on the GPU. And some of that might be going to the CPU, which isn't doing much, or maybe some is going to the CPU and taking away from the GPU. So it's hard to say for sure. I only recorded this and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which were of course the only ones that saw a major benefit. So overall, I think the goal of the cooling pad is reducing temperatures, not necessarily increasing performance by a ton. Looking at Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we get 5 more FPS overall on average. We actually lose a few FPS in Horizon Zero Dawn. We lose a few FPS in Forza Horizon 5. We lose a couple FPS in Cyberpunk. On the Ultra preset, we gain 4 FPS, and when we're doing frame gen, we gain 7 FPS. Time Spy goes up by about 1,000 points graphics score, although it's still not anywhere near the actual 175 watts that the Omen Max 16 is getting, even though it should be hitting there. There's plenty of thermal headroom for it to do so, and it's rated for 175 watts. So that's sort of a shame. And it's the same case in Steel Nomad. For some reason, I actually get a lower score in Steel Nomad. I ran this like 5 times just to make sure, and it is actually hitting 168 watts in Steel Nomad, but the score is for some reason a little bit lower. So it's kind of separating us even further from a full wattage 5090. And by the way, we're talking about 61.5 decibels of fan noise here, 62 almost, and that is extremely noisy. Like that can be heard from the other side of the house, not just the other room. Like we're talking down the hall, like you might get yelled at for that thing to turn off. All right, so for creators, this is a pretty great laptop, but before I get into it though, just keep in mind, it's not going to be friendly for you creators out there who are working on battery or USB-C a lot. So if you want really good performance in your creative apps, make sure you're plugged in. So let's start with Photoshop here. Okay, so Photoshop really loves these Ryzen AI9HX CPUs for some reason, and you can see it is approaching the top, just barely beaten out by the G16 with the same CPU and the Flow Z13 with a similar AI Ryzen CPU. In balance mode, it actually stays at about the same performance level, barely loses any performance, and the same can be said in silent mode as well. You can see all these Ryzen CPUs are just killing it in this benchmark. benchmark. So if you're a heavy Photoshop or Lightroom user, this is a great laptop for that. Just keep in mind, it is not the quietest. And also keep in mind on battery, it falls way behind here, hitting below a lot of much cheaper laptops with lower tier CPUs than this. And that's because that CPU single core falls apart on battery. Now, Premiere Pro is a lot more GPU heavy, so you can see it actually does pull ahead quite a bit, even from some 4090 laptops. The VRAM is getting used here. You know, the 50 series has native codec support for 422, which I'm not sure if it was already supported yet in the Premiere Pro benchmark here, but it looks like it, especially in balanced and silent mode, where it is pulling way ahead of everything else, along with the Omen Max. And even on battery, it still maintains a really good position here, because since Premiere Pro is just so GPU heavy and it doesn't rely on the CPU nearly as much. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the DaVinci Resolve benchmark to run on this. I think it's because of that 422 support not working right with the Puget benchmark, and the Puget benchmark just not being updated enough to run with the new Resolve 20 software that's been coming out. But I was able to get it to work on the Omen Max 16 using Resolve 19. And so I'm assuming that the Blade is going to be just a little behind that one, which is great because look how far ahead the Omen Max is compared to everything else here. Latency mod looking okay, not too great. It did have some pretty big spikes here and there, but overall not the worst I've seen. I also run a music benchmark for music producers out there. I run the Ableton demo session that anyone can replicate on their own device just by downloading the free version of Ableton and running the built-in demo session. In Ableton Live 12, this is with a ton of tracks and effects on this demo session. You're getting about 20 to 25% CPU load, which is pretty good. The lower the better, obviously here. And then in Ableton 11, which actually is slightly more demanding, it's hitting about the same, like 22 to 25%. So not a bad result overall. This laptop will be more than powerful enough to run almost any Ableton or music production session that you throw at it. All right, so starting with Apex Legends here. So right off the bat in turbo mode, you're gonna see it a little bit behind last year's Blade in both average FPS and 1% lows, and a good bit behind like the Legion Pro 7i from 2023. It's actually closer to the 2023 G14 than it is the Legion Pro 7i, but at least in balance mode, it pulls ahead quite a bit, now almost matching the 2023 and 2024 Blade. Not a bad result there. Now in Black Myth Wukong, it actually does pull quite ahead here, 76 FPS. Of course, it's only up against, 125 watt 4090s here. You'll see here soon though, I have some Omen 5090 and Legion Pro 7i 5080 benchmarks. You'll get a better understanding here in a second of where it falls with those. And speaking of which, Call of Duty Black Ops 6 is one that I've already benchmarked on those laptops, and yeah, check it out. We're falling pretty far behind the Omen Max and just slightly ahead of Legion Pro 7i, which actually gives me some hope because there were times like this, the 4090 Zephyrus G16 would fall behind even like the 4080 Legion Pro 7i. So we're still at least a little bit ahead of the 5080 here. And same goes for balance mode. It pulls actually quite a bit ahead here, but just keep in mind the Legion Pro is running way quieter than the Blade, and same with the Omen Max. So I really want to talk about Cyberpunk here because that one has a lot of good data, a lot of good benchmarks. I was surprised to see it actually falls a good ways behind in some of the benchmarks on this one. You can see the Omen Max and even the 4090 Legion Pro from 2023 and the 5080 model and even like the Flow X scene. Like a lot of 4090s and stuff are pulling ahead of the Blade here. And I think it's because some CPU power is really needed here in the benchmark. However, in balance mode, it does catch up quite a bit. Again, it is running loud though. So it's almost like a lot of these laptops are in their turbo mode as far as fan noise. And then here's balanced and silent mode. You've already seen the balance mode numbers. Silent mode, it's looking really good, 68 FPS, pulling way ahead of everyone else. But just remember, each fan profile for this guy is like a higher tier than the one before it. So silent mode is really like the same noise as balance mode in other laptops. Ultra preset, it falls way behind the Omen Max here, which was kind of surprising. I'm not really sure why it was such a huge difference on this one, especially with it being AMD. Usually the Ultra preset can actually favor some AMD CPUs, but overall still a decent ways ahead of some of last year's laptops and the year before. And then same thing in silent mode, catches up to the Omen. Kind of funny that the Zephyrus G14 from 2023 actually pulls ahead here in silent mode. On ray tracing overdrive, again, looking better than last year's laptops, but still not quite as good as a full powered 5090. And this is a game where you can actually hit 4K 60 FPS at ultra preset. So that's cool to see, but let's actually pivot a little bit to frame generation. So I want to talk about frame generation just for a second while we're talking about these benchmarks, because I've always been pretty conflicted on frame generation. Like I said before, I was pretty pissed off that Nvidia had to once again then come up with another stupid gimmick to get people to buy these GPUs. But I'm not gonna lie, for single player games, it actually is nice. And that really hurts to say, because like that comes from someone who really did not want to like frame gen, and I really didn't want to like multi-frame gen. So if you are a hater like I was, just bear with me here for a second, because it actually is not that bad. And the FPS benefits, they're undeniable. So playing around with multi-frame gen on the Blade 16, I was able to reach FPS numbers, you know, in the hundreds or 200s on settings that normally would have gotten me, you know, like 50 to 60 FPS. And I honestly could not see the artifacts even though I was looking for them. Especially with the new DLSS transformer model, I was really looking to find any sort of, you know, weird artifacts, bugs happening, and it was tough, you know. And as I flipped back and forth between multi-frame gen and no multi-frame gen, it was hard to go back to the old way. I found myself wanting to only play on the multi-frame gen, at least the 3X. 4X is okay, but really you don't notice the input latency as much as you think you would do. You actually miss how fluid it feels once you disable it. Now for multiplayer games, especially competitive ones, I will say like just probably best to not have that enabled, but for single player games like Cyberpunk here, man, just look at the difference in FPS. So just look at the numbers here, right? So this is the RT overdrive preset. This is basically as maxed out as you can get as far as ray tracing goes. You know, that 105 FPS right there was just the stock 2X frame gen, but we're going all the way up to 189 with 4X frame gen. And you can see like the Omen Max 16 hits 211 FPS on the most highest demanding preset that this game can offer. You're talking about settings that look like, you know, insane reflections and lighting bouncing off walls and stuff. So it's crazy to even see FPS numbers that high. I know this looks like an NVIDIA advertisement, and if NVIDIA saw this, they would probably love that I showed this, but I won't lie, for single player games, it is hard to go back after you've tried it out. So here again in RT Ultra, so this is not ray tracing overdrive, but you know, the next highest setting, you're getting about 250 FPS with the 4X frame gen, and the Omen Max 16 is approaching even 300 FPS almost. So it's like you're maxing out the refresh rate of the laptop on what would have otherwise been an extremely demanding setting where you were getting, you know, 77 FPS. So yeah, I gotta admit, unless you're like a competitive esports player, you're probably not gonna notice the difference in latency, but you will notice the difference in just overall smoothness and fluidity. And I'm sure NVIDIA loves slides like this, but I just have to throw it in there just because I know people are curious about it. I was super curious about it. I wanted to hate it. I don't really hate it. So yeah, just my opinion, just putting that out there. Oh, and of course you have to have at least a decent starting frame rate to make this actually work. You know, if we're starting at like 30 FPS and then using the 4X frame gen, it's not gonna feel that smooth and it's not gonna look that good. You know, having like a good starting point of like 50 to 60 FPS is really what you want for this to work well. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5, you can see the Blade 16 pretty much ties with the Legion Pro 7i here, hitting 151 FPS, which is higher than last year's and the year before's 4090 laptops. Actually not a bad result here. Still, of course, behind the max-powered Omen Max 16, but you can see in balance mode, it's looking really good, 138 FPS, and then in silent mode, 120. So this is another one I ran at 4K as well, and actually 106 FPS, not too bad. Barely ahead of last year's 4090s, but hey, I mean, that's still a full-powered 4090 that we are beating in a laptop that is way thinner and way lighter than that one. Helldivers 2, you know, it's not an insane lead over like the Zephyrus G14 or G16, but there still is a decent gap there, especially when you go to balance mode, and then even more when you're in silent mode. Horizon Zero Dawn does depend on the CPU quite a bit, which is why I think it falls behind a decent amount here, getting 145 FPS in turbo mode, while you have something like the HP Omen Max getting 181 FPS, and the new Legion Pro 7i 5080 getting 165. So that AMD CPU, yeah, it's really efficient, but it does not have the max power that these other guys are using on this one. However, again, in balance mode, we're pulling quite a bit ahead, almost matching the Omen Max, and then in silent mode, you know, 128 FPS, great result there. Again, this is another one I've ran in 4K. I didn't run the Omen or Legion on this yet in 4K, but 96 FPS, taking a good lead against the 4090 Blade 16, so that's great to see for such a thin laptop. All right, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is like my tried and true. This is one of my favorite benchmarks for pushing the CPU and GPU, and you know, because it's pushing that GPU and CPU, this is where, again, it's falling behind. It needs to have a little bit more of that cross load, you know, that total combined power. So you can see it falls way behind here. It's actually closer to like the Zephyrus M16 with the 4090 from 2023. But yeah, if you notice, all the laptops that are ahead of it are ones that have much higher powered CPUs that can hit, you know, 30 to almost 40,000 Cinebench scores. So it makes sense. And then in balance mode, you're pulling jumping ahead a decent amount. You're getting a lot closer to the competition here at 155 FPS. And then about the same thing in silent mode, 126 FPS. Wish it was a little better, but still a great result. And you can see in 4K, it pulls ahead of those 175 watts here. That's because 4K is almost completely GPU bound. You're starting to see that VRAM benefit here. You know, now we're passing those thicker laptops, and the only thing beating it is that full powered Omen Max 16. By the way, if you're getting the 5080 or 5070 Ti model, from what I'm seeing in benchmarks, it seems like the 5080 is performing about 10% worse than the 5090, and then the 5070 Ti is another 10% worse than the 5080. So overall, they're pretty close in performance. Like if you're getting, you know, 100 FPS on the 5090, you're looking at like maybe 90 to 92 FPS on the 5080, and probably like 80 to 83 or 84 FPS on 5070 Ti. And the gap could even be closer than that. We just don't have enough laptop reviews out there yet to tell, but from what I'm seeing, that's kind of like my educated guess right now. All right, so real quickly, pros and cons, right? So let's go over the quirks that I found, okay? So first we've got the trackpad issue, and then setting CPU voltage control causes your CPU performance to tank. We've got the CPU maxing out at 78 watts no matter what you set it to beyond that. We've got the CPU not hitting more than like 30 to 35 watts in games no matter what you set it to. We've got the CPU hitting a 2400 megahertz or so limit on battery, which lowers your performance on battery, and a huge drop in single core performance on battery, lower than most budget laptops, making everything feel really sluggish on battery. The keyboard stays relatively cool on the sides, but the center can get pretty hot. Battery life can be hit or miss. Either it locks into that lower wattage just fine, or sometimes it just gets stuck at like 20 to 30 watts of discharge and you only get a few hours of battery life. Fan noise, the silent mode is way too loud, especially under load. Turbo mode is way too loud, and balance mode's pretty loud too. This is overall like the loudest gaming laptop I think I've ever tested, especially coming from Razer, who usually has some of the quieter fans on the market. Fan controls aren't bad, but the fan curves don't seem to listen to the values that you set. So like setting 0 RPM, for example, it just won't happen. The fans are still going to keep going. Synapse as a whole is just a really buggy software. It did introduce some new features like CPU undervolting, but it also took away some useful ones like they had on the 2023 and 2024 Blade 16. Sometimes it loads really slow trying to open it, and if you try to close out of Synapse, your performance gets lowered. So the laptop requires Synapse to run at its full wattage. Speaking of full wattage, we don't really ever hit that ever either. We're getting, you know, 130 to 150 watts on the GPU. Even with the cooling pad, we still don't hit the full wattage of this GPU. We've got sort of wonky power tuning with balance mode targeting the same wattage level as performance mode, which makes me think like someone at the factory messed it up. Oh yeah, and the cooling pad kind of lowers performance in some games while hitting over 60 decibels of fan noise, which is extremely loud. You're only limited to one power profile with the cooling pad connected, so you have no control over what the fans or wattage is doing. And by the way, there's plenty of thermal headroom for it to push beyond those wattage limits, so it could easily hit higher than that. Neither of the USB-C ports are tied to the DGPU, so DisplayPort out is just not possible unless you're cool with Optimus on your external monitor, but that means no G-Sync or being able to use NVIDIA settings for your monitor. But on the good side, you know, this is an extremely thin and light laptop. It's extremely premium feeling. You know, it's got a nice metal chassis, glass trackpad. The power brick is smaller than the competitors. The speakers are pretty decent, especially if you tune them. You know, the display is beautiful. You know, it's same as the other 16-inch OLED competitors out there, but amazing display overall. We've got a great efficient CPU with a good track record. We've got good battery life when it's done right. The WASD area of the keyboard stays really cool, and overall performance is better than, you know, like 175 watt RTX 5080 in most games, and better than 175 watt 4090 in most games. So for the most part, you will see performance uplift coming from an older laptop. You've got Ryzen CPU undervolting in Synapse, and overall you've got a higher wattage output than the G16 with similar dimensions. So I'm conflicted on this laptop. Like, I want to love it. I actually bought this with the intention of possibly keeping it as my daily driver, just like my fellow Josh on YouTube, just Josh, who went through similar frustrations with his while also wanting to keep it as his daily. And I might still consider it like later down the line if they fix the software issues, but there's simply way too much that they've got to fix. On one hand, it's an amazingly beautiful laptop, and Razer just about checked every box with what I wanted to see in a gaming laptop in 2025, but on the other hand, they didn't seem to do it responsibly. It just wasn't ready to hit the market yet. In a gen of GPUs where we barely saw any performance increase across the board, that made it even harder to love this thing coming from, you know, like an RTX 4090 laptop, but that's NVIDIA's fault, not Razer's. To Razer's credit though, I will say that the gaming performance as a whole is pretty great. Like compared to say coming from an RTX 3080 laptop or a 4070 or even a lower wattage 4080, like there is a very noticeable improvement there. I think overall, if you're someone like me who likes to tweak tweak settings and be able to have quieter fans and push beyond stock limits, or sometimes you do demanding tasks on battery or on USB-C for a little bit, I don't think you're gonna like this laptop very much. Those issues are what's holding me back from keeping it personally. But if you find yourself to be more of a casual user and you just want a premium machine that feels great, it's easy to carry around, it performs extremely well for how thin and light it is, then I think you'll love this laptop. And it might even be the best laptop of the year for people like that. And if they fix the software issues, I'd say I might even consider it the best and most balanced laptop of the year just in general. But until then, I can't justify spending this much money on something that doesn't give me full use of the features that I paid for, especially when a lot of the competitors are doing just that. But I want to hear from you guys. Like, would those issues I listed bother you enough to return the machine, or would you keep it and wait it out, or just not care and just use it more casually anyway? I'll leave a pinned comment though, running with anything I hear about fixes and updates, and I might make another video even entirely if they end up actually fixing everything. So be sure to stay subscribed, because who knows, Razer might surprise me. But anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.